the school climate.
Oh.
Sorry about that. Izzy has been busy organizing with students around the climate strikes, but also more recently with some protests and occupations involving the Science Museum and their collaboration with fossil fuel companies. So we'll hear from Izzy more about what she's been up to and what what we can do to support and amplify their work. And we also have Zack Polanski. Zack Polanski is a representative of the Green Party. And I'm gonna go with the full introduction. So Zack is sorry, I had a whole paragraph to introduce you properly, and now I can't find it in all of my open notes. Zack, I'm really sorry. My brain is fogging here. You are you are a council member, right?
London Assembly member, like
London Assembly,
Environment Committee.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for helping me out. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Dottie, and Dottie, we just experienced together the madness that was the COP talks in Glasgow. But can you give us a bit of an overview of what happened in the lead up to the discussions, but also some of the outcomes and what we can learn from this process?
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Alena. Yeah, Alena and I spent like 2 weeks of being in together in Glasgow, because I also decided I will camp in her guest room for the whole event. It was madness how to get rooms and accommodations in Glasgow, and it seems that that's also a strategy to get activists, to keep activists out. So I think when we evaluate and look back from about what happened in the mobilization, we should not limit it to the 2 weeks events in Glasgow, because in fact the UK had because of COVID-19 had that very rare opportunity for the climate justice movements here to organize for 2 years because of the delay by 1 year, and that when I said it's rare, because not so many host movements and NGOs in host countries had that opportunity to build a host network, to build a coalition, to organize and mobilize people, and at the same time reach out to global partners, especially in the global south, for such mobilization. So within that 2 years, I think I will also speak with also another hat as a member of the coordinating committee of the COP26 coalition. One of the lessons that we can say is that we always had to be broad, and at the same time we are also responding to the fact that many people see climate change issue now as a global issue. So I was looking back when I first attended the Conference of Parties that was in Bali in 2007. And at that time, we were battling even with some of the other more established environmental groups. Because at that time I was still working in Asia. I was working with a regional group called Focus on the Global South. And for many of the Global South activists, they don't consider themselves as environmental activists. They don't consider themselves as climate activists even. So for them, they are more of a socio-economic activists. Those that are working for land rights, those that are working for the territories, for their rights, democracy, for defending their land, the waters, the rivers, from excessive mega development plans that were funded by international financial institutions. So from then on, it was still a campaign now on looking at issues of debt cancellations for the Global South, because if you're automatically allocating your budget to pay for your foreign debt, then there's no way that you can put money for climate actions. So those issues actually gave birth to the Climate Justice Network, which is a movement of movements as well. So looking back from 2007 up to now, at least in Glasgow, we never had to battle about saying that this is a global issue. So a lot of people see that it is a global issue that needs global cooperation. Second, the climate deniers lost the debate. So if you're still a climate denier, you're really stupid, or you're really like living in a cave. So at least those that are still denying are not denying because they are ignorant of climate change problem, but because they're benefiting and they don't want change. So that was very, very clear in Glasgow. And third, that it's an intersectional issue, that we can't just look at it as environmental issue. For many, especially in global South countries, it's a development issue. It's a fight for them, for their change of social economic conditions, and at the same time to defend the fact that if they are in the verge of developing, that the developed countries will not kick the ladder by putting on new measures, new policy and economic policies globally that spans from trade to finance to investment policies that could curtail their climate action. So these are all the issues that we are faced with. And in fact, for global justice now, we always say it's the economy is stupid. We can't deal with the climate crisis without rewiring the economy, without changing the governance of the global trade, finance, investment regulations and regime. So another look back as well is that we needed a strong and at the same time inclusive coalition that will look at how will participation happen. So in that aspect, I'm really, really proud at the work of our visa task force, for example. We had that in the Global Solidarity Working Group that had to battle the racism of the Home Office. Although sadly, we still were not able to help at least 2/3 of those that we were trying to help, because of the COVID rules, because of the high cost of traveling at the moment, the measures and the fast changing travel rules in the UK, where 1 month you're in the red list, second month you're not, and you're allowed, but at the same time, by the time that it happened, then all the travel costs and all the rooms in Glasgow were already gone. So we had to face those regulations inside the UK that doesn't consider that for a developing country, you need at least 6 to 7 weeks to process your visa. And then we're saying because many people in the UK don't need a visa to at least 140 countries, so they don't know how it was to apply for a visa to the UK if you're coming from Palau or Fiji or those territories. Of course, another thing is that linking the issue of vaccine apartheid, we were quite successful in messaging and getting that across, that if you come to think of it, those countries from the small island states, there were 38 recognized by the UN. Only 4 countries were able to send their delegates, both because of cost and also because of travel rules. Also because if you're coming from say from the Pacific, you need to cut across the world and have to go through the different connecting flights, and with all the different countries with varying degree of hurdles, that will be difficult. So for those who were able to jump through many hoops and were able to be in Glasgow, I think one of the positive and one of the successes that I would also enumerate is the way that, because of people's interest, the media also did an appropriate in terms of treatment to the climate issue. That the news is nonstop from the main media outlet, and also even from the local media outlets. The Leaders Summit were televised for the whole 2 days, like it was in the Olympics. Many people in Glasgow commented, wow, it was like the Olympics. You could hear everyone, all the heads of states stating their positions and their country situation. So related to that is that the strong voices, especially the critical voices of movements and civil society, were given an almost equal airtime in the media. If I compared it to the past COP, it was always struggle to get critical voices be interviewed. We had to pitch before, and the media is ignoring those critical voices. So at least in the last COP, we were given, maybe it's not equal, but at least a big amount of media time to say our critique, to counter the narrative. So in a way, we shifted the narrative from the UK government's pegging of ambition to the net zero instead of zero, pegging the ambition on finance. So we were able to say that this is actually not successful. This is not a success. We could not consider it a success. All those climate finance, all those mesmerizing figures were not real, because they will come as debt. They will come to be given to IFIs or banks, and also the fact that the city given a bigger role is a problem, because in the first place, the city is a problem. That's why we had those economic crises 12 years ago. So I think in terms of messaging, it was successful. Of course, the challenge, the remaining challenge is we still have geopolitics. We still have all those issues related with climate that were not given the appropriate time of day and measures on climate finance. There is still no appropriate climate finance, and the $100 billion per year, the most of the developing countries still have to wait, despite the fact it was promised in 2009. The idea as well, and this is one of our campaigning Global Justice Now, that even if after all campaigning, countries will decide to do climate action, they will always be faced with a threat of being sued by transnational corporations if transnational corporations see that their profits is at stake. So the big challenge of how do we actually lessen? I will even use the term, how do we suppress the power of transnational corporation remains to be a big problem. I'm not anti-corporation, but at this point, the asymmetry of power between corporations, states, and community are so gross that we have to change it. There's no way we can respond to the climate crisis if corporations are so powerful. So I think I must have eaten up all my time, and I will stop here, and I will look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothy. And I already have a couple of questions that hopefully we'll be able to circle back and follow up on. But I think you end on a kind of a useful note for me to turn to Izzy and ask her overall about her experience with the climate movements, but specifically this targeting that I personally find very heartening that I see in the youth movement, that is very unapologetically targeting corporations and going after the big names, and the fact that they receive reception in our cultural institutions and our educational institutions that they really shouldn't be seeing at all. I mean, shell should be a dirty word, really. It should be, it should be bleeped out from the public discourse, not be given, be allowed to be given sponsorships, and the rest with the rest of the fossil fuel companies, especially. But Izzy, do you want to chat to us a bit about how that shift has come about in the youth movement, and specifically about the Science Museum actions?
So I've been involved in the youth climate movement in the UK since very beginning of 2019, very end of 2018, when the youth strike movement started. And that was sort of a catalyst for a lot of youth involvement in politics and youth involvement in the environmental movement, because it was, for the first time, it was a movement that was created by and for young people. I was 14 when I got involved in this. I'm 17 now. And for me, at that point, seeing these protests that were entirely people my age, that was incredible. And for a while, the youth strike movement felt really, really powerful. We had a good year of sort of these really big, powerful, empowering protests. And then, like with every movement, I think people got disheartened. We weren't seeing change. Less people started coming. The policing got more violent. And then COVID hit. And that meant that our one tactic, our movement was named after and based on this one tactic of these big mass mobilizations, and that wasn't safe or responsible or legal to do anymore. And so we had to sort of stop and rethink, where do we go from here? And for the first part of the pandemic, we did nothing. Most of us were putting most of our energy into organizing in our communities and working on mutual aid projects to try and keep our community safe, which is an important part of climate action, is building those community networks and that community mutual aid. And that's the kind of future that, as climate justice activists, we're fighting for. But it meant that as sort of UKSCN London, as the youth strike movement, we weren't doing anything. And it got to a point where pandemic seemed to be getting a little bit better. We were back in school. We wanted to be doing climate campaigning again. And the first question we had was, what do we do now? We didn't really want to go back to the youth strikes and that model of protesting because it didn't feel safe, particularly in light of both the pandemic and also the policing that protests have seen over the last few months. And it didn't feel useful. We'd done it for so long, and while we'd gotten a lot of lip service from politicians, there'd been a lot of promises and pledges, but it hadn't achieved anything. So we decided we wanted to do something more relevant to us as a group of young people in London. We had a very short-lived mayoral election campaign, which we sort of ended up abandoning when we realized that, again, it didn't feel powerful, it didn't feel like it was going to achieve anything, and very few of us had any faith in electoral politics at that point. And so we were back at this point of trying to decide where we wanted to put our energy, what we wanted to work on. And conveniently for us at that point, the Science Museum here in London announced a new exhibit. And it's an exhibit called Our Future Planet, and it's about carbon capture and storage, which is a controversial technology on its own. But what they also announced was who's sponsoring this exhibit, which is none other than oil giant Shell. And we saw this and we thought, that's ridiculous. And then we saw an interview that the director of the Science Museum had done with Channel 4. And he was questioned on the exhibit, he was questioned on the sponsorship, but the thing that stood out to us was that they had a video of the exhibit, and inside this exhibition were placards from the youth strike movement and footage from youth strike protests. And for us, that was a moment of just, we were completely shocked. The fact that this movement that teenagers and young people and students had been putting so much time and energy into building, and intentionally from the very beginning trying to build a justice-focused movement, that could somehow be co-opted and used to greenwash a corporation with a horrific human rights record that is responsible for creating the climate crisis. So we knew we needed to do something about it. It felt like, okay, this is the perfect thing for us to be campaigning on right now. And we managed to get in contact with some incredible groups who have been doing the work on campaigning against oil sponsorship and fossil fuel sponsorship of cultural institutions for years. So we've been working in collaboration with BP or Not BP and Culture Unstained, and we've gotten to learn a lot from them and how you run these campaigns. And so that was 8 months ago when we started working on this campaign. And we started it off with a tactic that when we started the youth strike movement, we swore we would never use. We started the e-strike movement. We started a protest movement because we were done with the letters and the petitions and all of that. But we started this campaign with an open letter. And that letter was signed by over 100 NGOs, academics, scientists, public figures. We sent it to the museum, calling on them to drop Shell sponsorship. This was before the exhibit had opened, and to reframe the way they were talking about carbon capture and storage, because that is an equally important thing. The fact that Shell had been able to use the sponsorship platform to push a solution to the climate crisis that benefits them and doesn't benefit people and life on Earth. And we heard no response from them. So our next sort of escalation from that was to call a boycott of the exhibit. 8,000 people pledged to boycott it in 2 weeks. There was a petition that was set up at the same time, had over 50,000 signatures. We had protests outside on the weekends, which was a particularly funny moment for us because for years everyone had been telling us, oh, if you protest on a Saturday and you're not walking out of school, then people will listen to you. Then we'll take you seriously. And surprisingly, nothing happened because of our protest. And it got to a point where we needed to do something more, which is why we attempted back in June to occupy the Science Museum overnight. It didn't work. We made it to about 9 p.m., but it is still one of the things I've worked on that I'm most proud of, because from the very beginning of that, organizing that occupation, we wanted to be there to create an alternate exhibition. That was our goal. That was why we were holding that space. We wanted to make sure that the voices and the stories and the science that the Science Museum was ignoring or omitting would get to be heard. So we created a live stream. It was going to be a 24-hour live stream, a sort of mirror version of the climate talks live streamed events that the Science Museum had been doing, which had people like Tony Blair talking about climate action. And we wanted to have people from around the world, particularly young activists from the Global South, speaking on this live stream. And I'm incredibly proud of what we managed to put together with that, talking about everything from climate change as a migrant justice issue, talking about the lived experience of people and how the climate crisis has impacted them, talking about climate policy, and we had scientists, and it was going to be a really incredible thing. And unfortunately, the Science Museum decided to respond by calling the police on us, and the police decided to respond with 40 cops coming to arrest 20 teenagers. And we'd made a decision to call that occupation off. However, we realized that we couldn't let them silence us, and we wanted to do it again. So we were thinking from basically the night that happened, how can we do this again? And between that day and our successful occupation in October, it has come out that the Science Museum has signed a gagging clause in their contract with Shell, saying they're not allowed to say anything which would damage Shell's reputation. It's come out that they are going to be redoing their energy gallery to create a green energy gallery sponsored by Adani, which is an Indian conglomerate that is currently responsible for building the largest coal mine in Australian history, displacing Indigenous people, destroying communities' water supplies. 3 members of the advisory board and board of trustees resigned over that sponsorship directly after our occupation. And we were able to successfully hold that space. But more powerful, I think, than what we did inside the museum was what happened outside of the museum. And I got to watch this from inside the museum on a live stream. We held a vigil outside the Science Museum that night to remember all of the victims of the climate crisis, but also the lives that have been lost directly because of the actions of the Science Museum sponsors, because they're not just sponsored by Shell. They're sponsored by BP, they're sponsored by Equinor, and now they're sponsored by Adani. And we were really, really lucky to have so many people from around the world in London at that point, traveling through London on their way to Glasgow, because it was right before COP. And that was a really powerful, powerful vigil that we held. We had speakers from the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, who have been fighting to get shell off of their land to stop shell poisoning their water supply in the Niger Delta. We had speakers from the Free West Papua movement, where BP has been legitimizing Indonesian occupation. We had the Pacific Climate Warriors were there on their way to COP. It was a really, really powerful moment. And that reinforced something for me and for a lot of us who've been working on that campaign that's so, so, so important for us all in the climate justice movement and any wider social justice movement, which is that this needs to be an international movement and it needs to have an international response. And we need to build that solidarity and we need to build those links. And part of that in the UK means that we have a responsibility to be explicit in calling out the harmful narratives and solutions that are so abundant in conversations about the climate crisis. And particularly after COP, there's been a lot of discussion about these, and we need to be calling that out. We need to be calling out the overpopulation narratives that people like David Attenborough have been pushing on mainstream platforms and been really giving a lot of legitimacy to. It's a racist myth. It's not true. There's no science behind it. All it is racism and eugenics. And we need to be explicit in saying that. We need to be calling out this narrative that China and India are responsible for the climate crisis, and that we don't need to do anything in the UK because China and India are the ones who have really created this problem. We need to acknowledge the historical responsibility that the UK has in causing the climate crisis and the current responsibility we have for perpetuating it through what is effectively neocolonialism and climate colonialism. And another thing that I think we really need to talk about, and I think this is something where groups like Another Europe, who do a lot of work on migrant justice, come in, is how we link up the topics of climate justice and migrant justice. Because I definitely noticed around COP, there were a lot of people talking about sort of the bad parts of climate change, and how one of the bad impacts of the climate crisis is increased immigration. And no one should be displaced. No one should have to leave their home. No one should be forced to lose their land. No one should be forced to lose their livelihood. But immigration isn't a bad thing. And talking about it as immigration is this sort of unwanted effect of the climate crisis. People move, people immigrate, that is normal. And the climate crisis is going to be forcing people to immigrate, and that is bad. But we need to be opening our borders. We need to be welcoming people, because the UK is responsible for creating the climate crisis, and we can't be causing this crisis that's forcing people to leave their homes with one hand and then locking the doors on them with the other. So I think it's really important that groups like Another Europe, groups who are doing any sort of social justice campaigning, it's all linked together. The climate crisis is at the root of a lot of the other crises that we're seeing. They're all sort of inherently linked to each other. And the climate movement needs to be openly a justice movement, and we need to make sure that we don't stand for any of the racism and bigotry that sort of finds itself creeping in from a lot of different directions right now.
Thanks very much, Izzy. I mean, I was like buzzing on every word that you said, which is usually the case. Then I realized maybe this is me just being not a very forward-thinking chair. And Zack, it was absolutely not me trying to put you on the spot to put you after Izzy, who's already given us so much to think about, but also a lot of motivation and energy. But I wanted to really hear from you on something that I think runs through what Dottie was saying, but also Izzy just now. And it has to do with, on the one hand, working in coalitions, like building successful coalitions around the climate crisis, but also this contradiction between the our established modes of working, right? Like the usual protests, the usual open letters, the usual channels that we've used to get action going, and how that has often, been unsuccessful. What's the implication for that still within electoral politics? How do we make electoral politics effective again?
Thank you so much. And it's not putting me on the spot. In fact, if anything, it's really helpful to be able to bounce off everything Izzy and Dottie articulated so brilliantly. I just really want to endorse everything that they've said. And I don't want to repeat the scale of the crisis either, because it's been outlined there, particularly around its effect on people from ethnic minorities and in the global south, and effectively what has been neo-colonialism. But I think it is important to marker that just before saying anything, because essentially there's no environmental justice without social, racial and economic justice too, and all those things need to combine. And the first thing I just wanted to pick on was actually something Dottie said, which I agreed with entirely, that one of the good things from COP26, and I don't think there were that many good things, but one of the things that I think can be championed is that I didn't hear any climate denial. And I can think back to other COPs or other climate conferences where I've been to, where I've gone and that's been the first argument I've had to have is with climate deniers. And actually I didn't have any of that. However, before we celebrate, there's a lot of climate delay and a lot of moving around statistics. And just this week, as you said at the beginning, I'm a London Assembly member. I also chair London's Environment Committee. And I put forward a motion this week for the London Assembly to back the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill and to call on the Mayor of London to back that too. I'm really pleased that it did pass. And that was as a Green Party member, but also with Labour and Lib Dem support. However, the Conservatives on the Assembly astonishingly voted against it. If I'm honest, I didn't expect them to vote for it. I thought it was a step too far, but I thought they'd at least abstain. But actually still in 2021, when they've got a government suggesting that we're in a climate emergency and that we need to show leadership, to then vote against it in London is a little bit absurd. And some of the reasons they gave for voting against it were things like, we have the best carbon emission rates in the world, which we know is just not true because it's excluding aviation, it's excluding shipping. And also we have a historic moral and ethical responsibility, which Izzy was just talking about essentially, to make sure that we're reducing our emissions based on what we've done in the past and essentially repairing and climate reparations for those things. So I think we do need to be careful about not being too hard on ourselves. We are making progress as a climate movement, but also I don't think we should just celebrate that there's no climate denial, because actually there are still things going on. Now with that, I'm sorry I wasn't at the panel this morning, but I was actually out on the protest myself in Edmonton, which is in outer London, where a council or a group of councils are looking to expand an incinerator there. Now, I don't want to be too London focused, but I think this is a good microcosm of the problems that we're talking about. Edmonton has a population that is 65% from minority ethnic groups and has some of the worst air pollution in London already. And the fact that there is going to be a vote to extend an incinerator out there, which is going to pollute particulates and all sorts of disastrous things for the community there, where we know we've got children growing up with stunted lungs. So it's physically affecting their body from the air pollution. And it's being put in Edmonton for a very specific reason. The political power isn't necessarily in Edmonton. The media aren't particularly in Edmonton. They're very much focused in central London, in the city of London, and some of those kind of essentially middle-class greener places. And so I think politicians think they can get away with this, that they think we need more incinerators, we can just push this through. And I think this is a constant conversation in the climate movement about how do we create pressure that's educated, that's informed, so isn't just noise for noise sake, but actually noise on a spotlight that demonstrates the things that are going on and empower our communities to be able to feel like they can do something about it. Because sometimes the scale of the crisis is so bad that I think when we highlight it, if we don't come up with solutions, we essentially risk putting people into despair and immobility. So I think there has to be that tight line between this is a crisis, it's not enough to act, we are acting, but we are not acting nearly with the urgency that we require. And also, this is not over yet, and there are still things we can do about it. And I didn't expect to say this, but credit to Alok Sharma, who, you know, I don't agree with on a lot of things, but actually he's pointed out several times that if we want to get to net zero by 2030, we can't start in 2029. And I think that's a really important point. They're just kicking these deadlines, you know, into the distance is only going to cause further feedback loops and cause our carbon budget to extend, which means there's going to have to be even bigger changes to society. With that, of course, I know everyone on this call knows that the changes in society that we need to make, that Izzy and Dottie are alluding to, are, the emergency aside, good in and of themselves. They will create nicer, greener, cleaner societies that solve inequality gaps, that have better outcomes for women, that make sure that there was a discussion even about trans people just before this. Even things that can seem as abstract from the climate as people's identities are not abstract at all. All of these things are interlinked, and essentially we need systemic change. Now, just on the tube here, I was thinking about what would my 5 lessons from the climate movement be, and they're just very brief. 3 of them I would say are positive things we can all learn from the climate movement, and 2 things that I think the climate movement aren't doing great. And I don't say that as you know, I'm just out to criticize or hatchet them, because actually I would say some of the same criticisms could be applied to the Green Party. So the things I'm very aware of electorally as well. The first thing, though, I would say is, having been at COP26, and I'm sure this will marry with people's experiences who were there, I was very privileged as the chair of the Environment Committee to go to the negotiations, and also to go to some pretty high-level meetings with people to have discussions about net zero. However, what I was so aware of was the sterileness, the lack of energy, the lack of vision that came from those meetings, that just became very bureaucratic discussions about whose problem it was, where the problem was, etc. And it wasn't until I left the Ring of Steel, which was essentially this big ring of steel around COP where the meetings were going on, and you were out on the streets, that suddenly you would feel this wave of energy, of excitement, of people wanting change and knowing that a better world is possible. And it was just a really marked, not metaphorical, but literal physical difference of leaving a building and thinking, actually, this is where the change happens, right here out on the streets. And I remember a journalist thinking they were catching me out, because as I was leaving, they asked me what was going on inside. I gave them a fairly sensible interview. And then they said to me, they reminded me that I'd been arrested with Extinction Rebellion a couple of years ago, before I became an elected politician. And they said, how much of a politician have you become? Will you go and join the Kaylee that's behind you? And I was like, of course I'll go and join the Kaylee behind me. And they looked at me like, how can you be a serious politician that wants to make change and dance with a community? And actually, I think it's just as simple as that. Dancing, art, creativity, being in our communities is vital to representation. And I think there's become this real chasm between what people can do on the streets and what's allowed in chambers. And to give an example, this isn't me bashing Sadiq Khan, because on some of the things on the climate, he gets it. But on my very first day in the chamber, one of the very first things I asked him was about citizens' assemblies, and bringing people's voices into City Hall that weren't politicians. And his answer to me was that I had just been elected by over 250,000 people, and I was at danger of making myself redundant. And I think that's a totally unacceptable answer. And again, that's not just Sadiq. I think that's generally an answer that comes from the establishment, whether it's Labour or Conservative. And it's this idea that once you're elected, you don't need to be in your community anymore. You don't need to listen because you have all the answers. And I think something the climate movement is doing really well is, rather than expecting people to come to them, it's going out to people's communities and starting to talk to people. And I think the more we can get of that, the better. Which leads me to the second point. I think the climate movement is best when it's democratic, when it has flat structures. And yes, sometimes this is messy, and sometimes this has caused problems. I'm going back to XR again, because sometimes it can create decisions that not everyone necessarily agrees with. But I think that's democracy, and I think we have to work through that. In electoral politics, we have first past the post, and first past the post frequently causes, sorry, very loud traffic outside my window just to highlight the problem. First past the post frequently results in safe seats and politicians with vested interests that can even be tied to fossil fuel companies, or sometimes not as obvious as that, but still tied to people with questionable tastes. Now, this isn't knocking every politician who's in a safe seat. We have some Labour and even some Conservative politicians that are in safe seats and are still doing a good job. But however, there is a vast tendency to those politicians who were involved in the sleaze scandal, for instance, who are in safe seats because they know their seat is not at risk. If we could have proportional representation, we could have a fair voting system, which means every politician would be accountable to the people who elect them. And for those who don't know them, I'd really give a shout out to Make Votes Matter, who are a campaign organisation campaigning for electoral reform, which is proportional representation in the House of Commons. And although, again, it can seem distant from the climate movement, I think it's one of the biggest barriers to good climate policy is our unfair voting system. And in fact, in countries with proportional representation, their carbon emissions on average are 18% less than countries with first past the post. And the only countries with first past the post in Europe are the UK and Belarus. So that's my shout out for proportional representation. I'll move on more quickly because I don't want to hog the floor. But the third thing I want to say, and this is very evident in everything that Izzy said, but is the power of young people in the climate movement. And that is happening in electoral politics increasingly, but not nearly enough. And the climate movement is often led by young people. And that's fantastic because it's their society and their planet that essentially people from older generations, and myself included, have been messing up and have responsibility for. So I'm really glad to see their voices at the forefront. And I've been asked time and time again what my highlight for COP was. And it was when I went out of the main building and went to a fringe event about climate justice, which was 4 young women from Chile, the Philippines, Madagascar, and the UK, talking about climate justice and feminism. And I just listened to them and I just felt this overwhelming feeling of everything's going to be okay. And I don't mean in a complacent way, we're still going to have to work really hard. But actually young people so often just get it and they won't accept the ambiguity of the fudge that is so often delivered to them. And it's quite clear we're either going to face planetary destruction or we're not. We're either going to stand up for migrant rights or we're not. And we're either going to absolutely link workers' rights and social justice with environmental justice, or what we're doing is just not worth it. And so a shout out to the young people on that. With that too, I was an actor before I was a politician, and I think creativity that often comes from young people, but it can come from older people too. I don't want to be ageist about this, but the more we can make these things fun and engaging, I think the better. It doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the despair, we don't acknowledge how apocalyptic this is, but I think while we're campaigning, the more that we can find enjoyment and love in that, the more sustainable it is. And I think that's a way to avoid the burnout that Izzy was talking about, that lots of people faced understandably during COVID. I think we need to make sure that we look after ourselves and each other. So the 2 things I think we need to change. Insulate Britain have been really disruptive. Now, I'm not coming to bash Insulate Britain. In fact, I've been out on radio and TV defending their right to protest. But I do think sometimes it's been a misguided right. And all I mean by that is when you're stopping motorways, but allowing the Treasury to not put money into the dealing with the climate emergency, you're probably aiming your anger at the wrong place. And I love this quote from Aristotle that I've heard Caroline Lucas quote several times. So I'm quoting Caroline, quoting Aristotle, which is a long way down the chain. But anger is easy. The hard thing is to find the right amount of anger at the right time, in the right place, aimed at the right persons for the right purpose, or something like that. So I think we have to be specific with anger. And I do think Insulate Britain sometimes have missed the point. Now, that's not a problem in itself because I agree with their aims, but what it has allowed is Priti Patel and this Conservative government to increasingly ratchet up a narrative against peaceful protest that is starting to catch on, and we've got to challenge that narrative. But I think also while we're doing that and we're protesting, we have a responsibility to protest in the right place. And that doesn't mean it can't be disruptive. It absolutely should be disruptive sometimes, but it's really very specific about what we're doing and why we're doing it, because I think otherwise we risk for the dangers of being counterproductive. And finally, the lack of diversity. Sometimes there are more Conservative MPs from ethnic minorities in the House of Commons than there are people of colour at climate movement protests. And again, I said at the beginning, it's not just a protest problem. We have a problem in the Green Party, and it's certainly something I speak out on a lot. We've absolutely got to go to people's communities. We can't expect them to come to us. So we've got to be out there. And that isn't finding someone of colour and pushing them to the front and demanding they speak, because they shouldn't have to be doing that emotional labour unless they want to, in which case we should give them the space. But it's about nurturing people. It's about understanding that for a long time they've been ignored and they've got the lived experience of what these things are like. So these things can't be immediate fixes where we expect someone to do it tomorrow, but we've got to invest in people, give them the time and the space to be leaders. And we've got to give our space and our platform to those climate leaders, especially people from the global south. And on that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach. I think we can have a whole session at some point about protest tactics and what's the right amount of anger, because I think that's a discussion, and I think maybe we won't reach the same conclusion, you and I, but it would be useful to have the conversation anyway. And it is something that we'll need to unpick as we go on, as this fight goes on, because I think it's only going to get worse for us rather than easier, to be honest. And we actually have to finish in 3 minutes. So I am just going to give each of you a minute to answer just a very small question, which is, how do we transform the economic system to tackle climate change? What's the one thing we can do?
Should I go first? Because I'll be 10 seconds and I
Okay,
can give
go
more
for
space.
it. Go for it, Zack.
A carbon tax and use the dividend to fund a universal basic income.
That's very quick. I enjoyed that. Dottie.
Yeah, well, I will quote one of my mentors here. I know Susan George often say, we all know what is poverty, how we end up with poverty. So time to study the rich. So I think it is important to understand capitalism. Why is it inadequate? Why is it limited to responding to the climate crisis? So we have to know them more and how to defeat them.
Great. This timer is getting really stressful now, so Izzy, real quick.
I'm not an economist, but even I can tell that a finite planet cannot sustain infinite economic growth, the likes of which corporations and CEOs and some politicians are pushing for. And so if we want to have an economy that can address the climate crisis, it needs to be one that puts people ahead of profit and isn't focused around endlessly increasing capital.
Oh, wow. I think I put undue pressure on everyone because now we have seconds remaining. But it's been wonderful to hear from you. And I think we need to have a lot more strategic discussions about these coalitions that have been built. How do we take them further? Even at times when the focus of the world is not on the UK, next year when we're no longer the host nation, how do we keep building? How do we keep this massive amount of pressure that we did manage to put on the government, and that level of representation of the climate crisis and spokespeople and people from the global south to be on our mainstream media throughout the year, not just when there's an important meeting happening. Yes, how do we organize for COP27 in Egypt and then in the UAE?